Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Climate change is a problem of profound significance, and how we deal with it as a society is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. Research is essential to understanding how man is changing the Earth's climate, and also essential for how to define ways of managing the risks involved. Raising the visibility of climate change science as a critical issue is one of the main strategic goals that AGU has for this century. And it's important that we as scientists find ways to contribute to the sustainability of the planet in the face of profound human impacts. Today's panelists, Richard Alley, as Peter mentioned, is not going to be here this morning, regrettably. But we do have John Cook, creator and author of the website Skeptical Science, Tony Strawa from the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change, Dan Shatterfield, author of Dan's Wild Science Journal blog and chief meteorologist for WHNT-TV in Alabama. Each of these individuals has dealt with the challenges of communicating climate change science to a variety of audiences, and the results of their work has been of profound significance to not only the scientific community, but to the public at large. So with that, I would like to invite the panelists up for discussion.
Well, my name's Dan Shatterfield. I'm a meteorologist. I worked in television for 32 years. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I was in the studio one day, and one of the guests on the 5 p.m. newscast was talking about climate change. And he mentioned a few things, like you can't trust the surface temperature record, and that volcanoes produce much more CO2 into the atmosphere every year than humans. Both of those facts I knew were absolutely incorrect. And that's when I started thinking, you know, I need to start saying something about this. And against my better judgment, by the end of that newscast, I basically refuted both of those arguments, which started a little bit of controversy. And that took me on a road that led me here today. I ended up paying my own way up to Antarctica, and well, actually the Arctic first. And then I ended up being taken to Antarctica by the National Science Foundation. And then I spent 2 weeks at Nîmes, the North Greenland Eemian Ice Core site on the Greenland ice cap last year. And got to see the oldest piece of ice ever pulled up from the bottom of the Greenland ice sheet. And I've met a lot of climate scientists, and over the last 7, 8 years, I learned a bit more about climate science than most meteorologists know. And I think one of the reasons that so many meteorologists are skeptical about climate science is that we go to work every day and we know how very difficult it is to forecast the weather for the next 3 to 5 days. So it's very natural to make the mistake of thinking that weather and climate are the same thing, and then say in your mind, how can they possibly forecast what the weather's going to do 100 years from now? Well, you can't. But you can forecast what the climate is likely to do 100 years from now. So just some thoughts about how I've talked about climate change, especially in a part of the country where Rush Limbaugh is considered to be slightly on the left. And so here are some thoughts. Basically, it's called Reporting the Science and Avoiding the Politics. Now, there's some good news here. This is from Ed Maybach's group and his study. And if you really look at the average person in the United States, most of them now agree that we have a problem. I think the deniers are a very vocal group that get a lot of attention, but based on the email that I get, there aren't that many of them, really. There really aren't. Now, there's more bad news. Most of my viewers get their science from places like that, mainly the internet. Now, a few of them get it from Burger King. That was up in Tennessee. The company, Burger King, actually decided that they really didn't want that up on all their Tennessee Burger King outlets, and it came down a couple of days later, but not before the Memphis newspapers had a few pictures of it. And then the average person connected to science that any one person normally sees every day, unless you're in science or unless you're here, is the guy doing the weather on TV. People like me. You know, the average American sitting at home, not in a classroom, doesn't normally run into anyone connected with science on a daily basis, except the guy who does the weather at night, or the girl. Now, that can be good, but the problem is a lot of the folks doing weather on TV have very little background in science. Some have quite a bit. And they tend to be an impressionable group to people like the Heartland Institute. And about 300 weathercasters around the country received that booklet 2 years ago. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but basically it was written by a gentleman named Anthony Watts, who did TV weather for a while. And it says you cannot trust the temperature record because out of 1,200 weather stations around the country, only 70 of them, only 70 are really any good. And this was, well, I heard this on several TV outlets after this pamphlet came out. And unfortunately, the folks who did the weathercast didn't wait long enough to look into it, because a week later, the National Climate Data Center took those 70 good stations and they compared it with the overall temperature rise record from NASA and NOAA. And it turns out if you just use those 70 stations that are supposedly the only good ones, the temperature rise is greater than what NASA and NOAA and the Hadley Center have been saying. And that was kind of the last straw. I wrote that up on my blog and said, what's wrong with this? Well, that's one way of handling it. There are other ways. And one thing I did is a little bit of humor. And so I'm going to show you a 5-minute clip that covers one of the most enduring climate myths out there and how we handled it. And I had a lot of feedback about this, and believe it or not, only a few negatives. And I think one of the reasons is because we did use some humor in this. And before I play this, I want to remind you about something. Remember when you're sitting at that Thanksgiving dinner and you always have that uncle who believes the moon landing was a hoax? Or is talking about chemtrails? How many of you have heard about chemtrails in this room? Yeah. How many of you are scientists and have heard about chemtrails? Not very many. Yeah. See, if you're in TV weather, you hear about this kind of thing. You don't, if you're a scientist, you don't want to know about the chemtrails. Believe me, it'll scare you. All right. So most people just look and shake their heads at their Uncle Henry when he starts going on to talking about chemtrails. It's always been my belief that the best thing to do with Uncle Henry is to look him straight in the eye and say, Uncle Henry, you're nuts. I thought I would end quickly here just by saying some of the lessons I've learned. First of all, stick with the science. You know, what we do about climate change is a political question. The reality of it is a scientific question. And normally when I go out to a group, especially a group that has a lot of climate deniers in the audience, and that's most of them where I work, the first thing I say is I have no idea what we do about climate change. That's a question we have to decide. I'm only here to talk about the science. It's fairly disarming because most of the people who are skeptics, almost all of them, are basing their skepticism on fear, either fear of one world government or higher taxes or someone's going to take away their pickup truck. That's where it comes from. It's not based, for the most part, on science. And there's also another factor, and that's that about 6% of the people out there believe the moon landing was faked or that there's chemtrails. You're never going to change those folks' mind. Don't waste your time trying to do so. And if you get a retired engineer from NASA that says they all have it wrong, send them to John Cook's website. That usually helps. And then the last thing, when the ear competes with the eye always wins. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself why Dr. Michael Mann is so despised by the Attorney General of Virginia and many skeptics out there. It's because he produced the one simple graphic that says everything about climate. Thanks.
So I publish skepticalscience.com, which is the main point of this site is to look at climate myths and refute them with peer-reviewed science. And the website's best known probably for an iPhone app, which we released in February last year. And the way this works is Dan was talking about having that crazy uncle that you meet at a family dinner who argues with you that global warming's a hoax or it's all caused by the sun. And And what the iPhone app allows you to do is take your phone out of your pocket, just search for the myth that he's throwing at you, and what it does is it provides what the peer-reviewed science says about that myth in plain English. And it also lets you look at the data, look at what the evidence tells us about each myth. So over the last few years, the way we've presented the science has evolved, and I often get a lot of suggestions from readers and people looking at my site, suggestions on how we can more effectively and better communicate the science. So usually these are unsolicited suggestions, but everyone's keen to help. So a few years ago, I got someone saying, you have these long rebuttals, and often it's a lot of information, and what you really should do is just summarise all that in one. You should have a one-line summary of every rebuttal on your site. And what I thought when he suggested this was, well, I was sceptical that you could actually boil all the science down into a single line. But what I said to him was, well, if you want to have a try, knock yourself out. And a few weeks later, he sent me this Word document where he'd taken every rebuttal on our site and boiled it down to a single line. And so we use that on the website and on our iPhone app now. Now, around the same time, I was talking to a Sydney programmer who had just created a Twitter bot. And what this program did was it searches through Twitter, searches through all the tweets every 5 minutes, and if it finds a climate myth, it automatically tweets a rebuttal response with a link to a page that has a full rebuttal. And I thought, wow, that's taking new media to a whole new level in ways to communicate science. And so I just had all these one-line responses dropped in my lap. So I forwarded this document to the programmer and said, will this be of any use to you with your Twitter bot? And he said, well, this is great, but can you get them all down to 100 characters? So another suggestion I got was, it came from an astrophysicist from Sydney who was reading this blog post by Gavin Schmidt at Real Climate. And what Gavin was suggesting was that communicators should explore communicating their science at different levels so that, to reach different audiences. And he used the metaphor of ski slopes with the green circle for beginners and the intermediate and the advanced. And my immediate thought was, well, that's hundreds of hours' work. So I asked him if he was interested in helping, and he wasn't. So, but the idea was very compelling from both a communication point of view, because how to reach those different audiences is always a challenge for science communicators. Do you write at a basic level, which alienates the more informed readers, or do you write at that higher level, which then goes over the head of the average layperson? And this was a way to let me have my cake and eat it too. And I also like the idea from an education level, where people can come in, read that basic level, and then once they're all over that, then they can, I guess, upgrade to the next level and deepen their understanding. But what really, even though I knew this was a lot of work, what really tempted me into going down this path was at Skeptical Science. I was just running it solo, and for years I'd been trying to get people to help me write the site, try to recruit other bloggers to help me debunk all the myths. And they come out on the internet so often that it's more than one person can respond to. And I hadn't really had that much success. Everyone's busy, and it's hard to I guess, to get people to volunteer to help with this kind of thing. And so I thought, well, maybe this project could be the focal point that could be the catalyst in building a team. So what I did was I put a call to action on the website. I did a blog post saying, who wants to help convert all my intermediate, more technical rebuttals into plain English? And immediately there was a flood of volunteers offering to help. And looking back at it now, I think why it was so successful compared to all those years of frustration leading up to it was the fact that it was a specific project with a clear goal of creating these series of plain English responses, and people could see that they could do it. So, and I guess I've taken from that just behaviour change in general requires giving people actions that they can see doing and clear benefits from those goals. Now, so at that point I had a whole string of volunteers who were offering to help, and suddenly I thought, oh, I better create a system that will allow them to actually contribute to the site. So I created a forum where all the authors could get together and collaborate and critique each other's work. And immediately there were about 20 or so rebuttals being worked on at once. So then I had to organise the flow of information. So what we created was an internal review system, which was like our own blogging form of peer review, where as people submitted rebuttals, once the other authors thought that it was good enough, they'd give it a green thumb, and you can see all the green thumbs going down the side of the forum. And once the rebuttal got up to about 5 green thumbs, generally it was of a high enough standard for publishing. And this is what I consider is probably one of the strongest elements of skeptical science. Not only that we crowdsource the writing of the content, but we also crowdsource the reviewing of the content. And that makes for high quality communication. And so as a result of that, we've now written almost all of our rebuttals at several different levels, and there's plain English versions of each of them. But even more important than that, now I've had that team of writers that I've been fantasising and dreaming about for several years. And what was interesting was how it came about was not a slow incremental build-up, but it just happened in a flash. And that's one of the interesting things about social media, is that it's like a non-linear chaotic system where you can just have tipping points where something just collapses into a new state. And that makes it unpredictable, but also quite powerful and exciting. Now, one of the elements of our basic rebuttals, trying to write in plain English for the average layperson, is a strong reliance on using simple, clear graphics to communicate the science. And so over time, as we were building up all these plain English rebuttals, we also were starting to build up a whole library of graphics. So at one point we decided to collect them all into a single resource of graphics with a Creative Commons license, so that other communicators could take the graphics and use them in their own communications as well. And so what we found was we started finding the graphics just popping up in lots of unexpected places. I was watching a YouTube of Admiral Titley from the US Navy, and suddenly, hey, there's my graphic up on the screen. And then I was reading the NOAA State of the Climate report, and one of our graphics was featured in there. It was without attribution, but so hi to any NOAA people in the room. And also the URL for the graphics too, I've just put it up there, is sks.to/graphics. If anyone wants to have a look at them, and you're welcome to use them. Now, an interesting thing about the graphics is you find with social media, you really never know what will go viral and what other blogs and tweets, well, Twitter accounts will pick something up and start spreading it around. But what we have found is that strong graphics that tell a story are usually the things that go viral the quickest and the widest. And so about a month or so ago, this was a graphic that we posted on Skeptical Science, an animated GIF, which basically, I'll play it again, it showed that over a period of long-term warming, you can pick any short period in there and where temperatures drop, which is a way to, if you want to cherry pick a short period to try to tell people that global cooling is happening. It just exposes that method even in a long-term warming trend. And this graphic went viral all over the blogosphere. And since then there's been a trend at Skeptical Science where they've been creating a whole series of animated GIFs. I think they're trying to replicate the success of this one, although this has been the most successful one so far. And another example of something going viral is just a week ago, last weekend, I published this book on the website, just a free online booklet. And what this is about is just giving a practical guideline on how to debunk myths by summarising all the psychological research on misinformation. And I published it on a Saturday. There was a couple of days it was fairly quiet, and then suddenly the hits went up 150,000 downloads in a single day. And so since then, over the last week, there's been 280,000 downloads of the booklet. And what happened was a series of just a couple of big websites, not even related to climate, posted it. Richard Dawkins posted it and said, "Hey, this is great for debunking myths." And it wasn't about climate myths. It was about responding to misinformation of any type. And a Muslim website posted saying this would be great for responding to anti-Muslim myths. And yeah, a whole series of websites that were completely unrelated, which was quite interesting. Another booklet we produced about a year ago was a scientific guide to global warming skepticism, which was, I think it was a 12-page booklet just explaining the science with lots of graphics, very simple English. And over the last 12 months, a number of translators from over the world have just stepped forward and offered to translate it, volunteered. And currently there's been 15 translations, and I think there's 3 more in the pipeline. So that's been very effective. I think there's been about 700,000 downloads over the last year. So it's been a great way just to get the simple message about climate science out to a lot of people and a lot of languages. And it's an example of social media, how a lot of people pitch in and want to help. There's a lot of enthusiasm and passion for communicating. And I think a measure of the power of social media and how crowdsourcing, how effective it can be, is this comment on a climate skeptic blog about skeptical science, where he talked about how speculating that our website must be a front for the IPCC and it would need a team of professionals and a few PR experts. and the first response I got when I saw this was to forward the comment to my wife, who designed the website, just to say, "Honey, you're the equivalent of a team of professionals and PR experts." And I was tempted to post a response to explain that this is what happens when you combine social media with a passionate community. But then I figured they would just assume that answer was part of the whole conspiracy, so I didn't waste my time. And so just to finish off, I would like to suggest to any climate scientists who have ever had to respond to misinformation in the past, that if you want to get your rebuttals, your content that you've written out in front of more eyeballs, then please feel free to email me. And I've got my email address up there. And what we can do is add that rebuttal to our database, and it'll go out on the iPhone to 70,000 iPhones, so that the next time someone has a crazy uncle who throws that myth at them, they can have it at their fingertips. Thank you.
My name is Tony Strawa. As Peter mentioned, I'm one of 24 Catholic climate ambassadors in the United States. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I first want to say that the topic of my talk is trying to present the climate crisis as a moral issue. The media that I typically use is presentations just like this one here. So that's kind of the media that we'll be talking about. But in any event, this approaches the topic a little bit uniquely for this particular forum, and because of that, I first wanted to spend a few minutes talking about who I am, what the Catholic message is, and then go on from there. So see if our luck continues. Hey, great. Okay. So the Catholic Church seeks to cast the climate change issue in a moral light, and by doing so, transcend different ideologies, be they political or religious. So this approach works for Democrats or Republicans, we believe. In any event, the tone was set in 1990 for Pope John Paul II's message to a message of world peace, where he said that the ecological crisis is a moral issue. It's a moral issue because it affects nature as well as humans. And the U.S. Catholic bishops later further defined this by claiming that that climate change issue is about protecting the human environment as well as the natural environment. And in 2006, they established the Catholic Climate Coalition, which was previously called the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change. They're interchangeable. And so at this point, I guess I would like to ask the audience, how many of you know that the Catholic Church has taken a strong position on climate change? All right, that's not too bad. I'd say that in general, when I ask that question to Catholic audiences, the response is about not as good, typically. So in any event, in order to try and spread the word, the U.S. Catholic bishops formed a cadre of 24 of us Catholic climate ambassadors around the country, and our job is to spread the message predominantly to Catholics. Okay, the Church's position, I believe, can be summed up in three concepts: stewardship, solidarity, and prudence. Stewardship is basically our call to take care of the environment. Okay? As Christian stewards, we receive God's gifts gratefully. We cultivate and share them in justice and return them for use by future generations. This idea was also presented by our present Pope, Benedict XVI, in 2007. Where he said, preservation of the environment, promotion of sustainable development, and particular attention to climate change are matters of grave concern for the entire human family. And he said this actually in a joint statement with Patriarch Bartholomew. The concept of solidarity means that we are all one family. And as such, we are called to act for the common good of all people, particularly those who are the most poor and vulnerable. And again, Pope John Paul said it very succinctly in 1990. We cannot interfere in one area of the ecosystem without paying attention both to the consequences of such interference in other areas and the well-being of future generations. And so solidarity takes into account not only all people who are around today, but also future generations. Okay. And finally, in light of the various scientific facts that we've heard about from the other speakers over here, we believe that people of faith are called to prudent action. Okay? Church leaders are not scientists, but they rely upon the expertise of groups of scientists who study climate and its impact on humanity, such as the IPCC and statements made by the AGU. And these statements, two of these statements at least, are that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and incidentally that finding was recently confirmed by a Berkeley group led by Professor Mueller. Actually was funded by a group of climate skeptics. And finally, that the warming of the climate system, that there is very high confidence that the net effect of human activity since 1750 has been one of warming. So your standing in the science community lends credibility to the fact that the science behind global warming that's presented by IPCC and other groups is valid. As a scientist, you're saying that you have studied these figures, the findings of these climate scientists, and that you agree with their conclusions. It also gives you a chance to, on a first-hand basis, refute skeptics' comments that may be made in the audience. So, So in light of these facts, the Church calls us to prudent action. This past October, Pope Benedict encouraged world leaders in Durban to agree on responsible and credible response to this worrisome and complex phenomena, taking into account the needs of the poorest and the future generations. Now, the Church itself does not take a position on any particular climate mitigation or adaptation program. However, both the Vatican and the U.S. bishops align themselves with actions that address climate change, that take into account core Catholic values, that benefit the common good with a priority concern for the poor. Pope Benedict VI, along with other Catholic groups, the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez, have joined people of all faiths in calling upon the international community to take urgent action at the UN Climate Change Conference in Durban, which is going on right now. The Church also supports groups such as the Catholic Relief Services, which work with local and international governments that assist all people based on their need, not based on their creed or nationality or religious beliefs. Okay. So that's a little bit about the message that we're trying to get out. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about some suggestions on how to better communicate that message. The first, and I think the most important thing, is to put a human face on the effects of climate change. Climate change is important because of how it affects humans, and so it's important to bring that out to people. Climate change is not just facts and figures. However, you do need to present some scientific information. When you do, make an extra effort to be accurate, up to date, and as John said, include where you got your source material from. So in this particular example, it shows data that I downloaded just the other day from the NOAA website. So the source is NOAA 2011. And you'll note that the data only goes up to 2009. That's because there's a lag in processing the data and getting things up onto websites and in reports and whatnot. Okay, try and make abstract concepts real. So I find that people don't really have a good grasp of what a pound of CO2 is. And so what I typically do with an audience is I'll hand out a bunch of balloons. It turns out that a 9-inch balloon, when blown up, holds about 1 liter of gas. And I ask them, how many balloons then do you think it takes to make a pound of CO2? And the answer is about 230. And when you dilute that amount of gas at 390 parts per million, you find that it fills a room about 27 feet by 27 feet by 27 feet, which is almost the size of this room here. So that kind of makes a nice story. It also coincidentally is the amount of CO2 that's emitted by a typical car after having driven for a mile. So every time you drive a mile in your car, you end up polluting a section of air about the size of this room. And I find that really makes a connection with audiences. No matter what the age of people are, everybody likes a balloon, and it gives them a feel for a connection between what they're emitting and what the impact in the climate is. Okay. So what I'll also do is present other reasons for decreasing fossil fuel use. It, of course, reverses climate change. It turns out that fossil fuel burning accounts for most air pollution. Using foreign fuel sources can cause national security issues. Saving fuel can save you money. And of course, there's the moral responsibility of the impact of the fossil fuel. And a lot of people in the audience, even if they don't want to stop or cut back and reduce burning fossil fuels because of the climate or because of moral reasons, they'll do it because it saves them some money. And that's okay. Maybe they'll get into the habit and they won't want to stop when they start doing that. Another effective technique is to combine a brief discussion with the documentary. In the October issue of EOS, the AGU weekly paper, there was an article on using documentaries for earth science education. But in this, the folks in this document had a fairly large budget. But you don't need a well-known speaker or need to spend a lot of money on advertising. Just preview the documentary that you're showing. Target your comments. Keep it brief, and leave lots of time for questions and answers. I find that a personal anecdote will help you relate to the audience and help the audience relate to you. And so for this, I like to rely back on my NASA background. As Peter mentioned, for 20 years I've been an atmospheric scientist over at NASA Ames Research Center just down the road. And the anecdote I use is to talk about a space station. Ideally, a space station is a closed system. There's no transfer of mass, which would be food and water, and it's just energy input from the sun. And so the International Space Station is working towards that goal. As an example, they are recycling most of their water. And so NASA is working with the International Space Station just as we should be working with the Earth, and that is trying to make it as sustainable as possible. And at this point, it's always good for me to use my standard disclaimer, and that is the fact that even though I work for NASA, the views I express in this presentation are mine and not necessarily those of NASA. Okay. And also, we've heard Dan mention using humor to help introduce the topic, and I think that's a very good technique. I typically use just little cartoons and stuff. I'm not that creative. So most people you'll find have changed light bulbs and they turn the thermostat down and things like that. So it's important to acknowledge that, the stuff that people have already done, and challenge them to take the next step. And so along those lines, it's good to have some simple and practical suggestions for action. And here is a chart showing a menu of how to reduce electricity usage. It's based on a program that we worked on with the local chapter of the Sierra Club and also with some folks from Stanford's Precourt Institute. You'll notice that the first one there is don't be a washout, wash dishes with cold water and wash your clothes with cold water and use the rinse or use a moisture sensor. It's hard for me to read from over here on the dry cycle. And you'll notice that the total number of balloons you save is about 240, which is about a pound of CO2, right? And it also saves you about 50 cents based on the average cost of electricity in California. One thing that really caught my mind was the last one on that list, which is that if you turn your LaserJet printer off or to standby when you're not using it, that can save you about 2.5 pounds of CO2 a day. So that was pretty significant. Taking it to the next step, be familiar with the local organizations that can help people financially or with information. So locally, Santa Clara County has a rebate program for energy audit and energy upgrades, and the other three there are just samples of a couple of different California initiatives that can help you. So this kind of information is very good, and it helps people take the next step. And so, you know, as I was listening to Dan and John talk about how to reach people, it seemed to me that you know, the science case, I believe, has already been made. And one of the reasons I started working as a climate ambassador is not to argue with people about the science, but to try and get them to take the next step, to act and do something about it. And it seemed to me that if we had like an app or a text message or something like that, that would remind them of simple things that they can do throughout the day. Oh, don't forget to turn off that printer or put it on standby or something along those lines. That would go a long way into to try and actually get CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions reduced. And so my challenge to you, which is the first challenge I'll have today, is if any of you are interested in doing that stuff, I can't act myself out of a paper sack. So if any of you are interested in doing that, let's get started in working on it. Okay, so that. Okay, one of the devices that the Catholic Climate Coalition uses to engage people is to ask them to sign what's called the St. Francis Pledge. And the pledge essentially is to pray, to learn about the implications of climate change, to assess what the best courses of actions are, to act to change your own behavior in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to advocate for Catholic principles and for community and government organizations to change their activities and to change their policies. So this chart that we have here is a poll of 1,000 Catholics, and it has asked people to rate whether or not they have taken some of the actions that are talked about in the St. Francis Pledge. You'll see on the bottom, to pray, to learn, to assess, to act, and advocate. And if you've done that, the numbers are in blue, or the bar chart is in blue. And if you are willing to, the bar chart is in red. And even though this database is 1,000 Catholics, I think it's representative of people in the United States as a whole. And there are a couple of trends over there. People are, as we've seen from some of the previous presentations, the majority of people in the United States buy the fact that the climate issue is a serious issue. The trick is getting them to act on that belief. And we see over here that people have done various things, but there's a lot more folks who, for whatever reason, even though they might believe in climate change, they're willing to take this action, but they just haven't done that. So they need an impetus in order to try and get them to act. And so that's I think where we come in. In the science community, I believe it's our responsibility to engage people and to engage them on the moral repercussions of climate change and motivate them and act and advocate for prudent action. Thanks very much.